Matters.
Yeah. The magazine that doesn't know how to use Twitch, but we have other so do we want to go around doing those short introductions that we talked about?
Yeah. Steve, do you want to start us off?
Sure. So, hey everyone, I'm Steve, and I'm a co-editor on Strange Matters. And we started this project like too long ago, or the idea of it was several years ago, and then the serious work began on it, I want to say like 2 years to 1.5 years ago, like around when the pandemic started, I suppose. And I am super excited to finally be at the home stretch and can give the magazine to y'all in digital and physical form very soon. My kind of background, I guess, is I'm mostly on kind of the nonfiction side of things in the writing. I have a piece on inflation that I'm pretty excited to share with you guys in issue 1. I studied economics. I've been pretty active in like certain circles of heterodox economics in particular. So the people who are like the groups of economists who are on kind of not the fringes, I would say, but they've been influences on the magazine's work as far as approaching topics in economics in a different way that sort of emphasizes like social relations and social provisioning more so than say strict like neoclassical or mainstream economic interpretations. Yeah, and back when I was studying economics, Occupy Wall Street was going on, and I kind of got swept up in that and got politically active through that and for the socialist left. And ever since that time, basically, I've always wanted to start a project sort of like this. I didn't always envision it as being a magazine, but I knew there should be some sort of container for heterodox thought and non-dogmatic ways of thinking through problems in all sorts of disciplines, as well as art, culture, philosophy, and poetry. So yeah, pleased to meet you all.
Cool.
Do you want to go?
Oh,
I can. You should go.
No, you should go. No, okay. Do we want to rock, paper, scissors over it or what?
No, you should go. I insist.
Okay, fine. So hi, my name is John Michael Colum. My friends call me JMC. I wear a couple of hats. I'm a writer and a journalist. I've worked as a reporter for USA Today and other places, but then that was kind of like, very early career. I was doing internships in college where I got the chance to do that kind of stuff. And that whole, news industry kind of like turns out not to exist in the way that people think it does because it's kind of collapsed. So I decided that I would, work some odd day jobs. Like, I worked at the New York Public Library, worked at like, a marketing kind of thing for a while as a day job while being a freelance writer for little magazines. So I've written for The Point, I've written for In These Times, I've written for Brooklyn Rail and a couple other places, usually on some kind of combination of topics having to do with culture and art on the one hand and libertarian socialist politics on the other. So the probably the piece that I'm proudest of is and I'm also the literature editor at The Point, where we kind of publish the fiction and other kinds of things that we think are kind of marginalized in the contemporary American literary scene. So I decided to hop onto the Strange Matters project because I thought that there was a real need for both kind of popularizing ideas that have been kind of percolating in the margins of the radical left for a long while without having actually, ingrained themselves in socialist consciousness within your kind of rank and file socialist movement people. And also as just a place where we could generate new ideas, because in a lot of ways we're stuck. We have these old ways of doing things and these old ways of thinking, that maybe serve their purpose in their time, but like are oftentimes now kind of more blinders in looking at the situation that's right in front of us. But meanwhile, we have a situation where if we don't figure out how to do things like the green transition or like radical democratic self-management of workplaces and neighborhoods, or economic planning at scale that's democratic rather than autocratic, we're not going to be able to have real answers to the problems that people are facing. And this is especially true of the libertarian socialist left, which doesn't believe that just taking over the state and having it own everything is socialism. So as a result, we want to create a space where we could generate the new ideas about how to do things, not because we, the editors, have the answers, but because we want to create a space where all of us together, us, our writers, our audience, and so on, can kind of work through it together and get into it and hear people from different perspectives, especially marginalized ones, and figure out if we can, generate next steps to move forward. And that's the mission of the magazine, at least as I see it. And that's why I'm so interested in it.
Thanks, James E. Well, I'm Frances. I work in design and architecture, research and practice, I guess. I'm a co-editor, so but I'm also design editor of the magazine, and I've been involved in left politics, throughout my college years in the United States. I have an accent. I'm twitching into you or zoom twitching to you from South Africa right now, which is why the windows, you can see a dark sky outside my window. And yeah, I like Steve never envisioned myself setting up a magazine until I met a whole bunch of wonderful people on the left and experienced America and thought that it was a very meaningful thing to do. And I think I speak accurately for everyone that we're coming at this project in a very sincere way. We all believe quite deeply in the messages we're putting forward, political and economic, and we're really dedicated to the project that we're setting out here, and we're hoping to cultivate a really open and a space for really open and sincere exchange. That being said, half the magazine is political economy and practical matters, and the other half is artistic and cultural. So I suspect I'll contribute to both ends of the magazine, but I may find myself more often contributing to the back pages. Something that unites all of the editors, that maybe others can bounce off on this point, is that we're all kind of generalists in some fashion. JMC?
Generalist in some fashion? Sorry,
Bohemian.
Oh, yeah. I guess bohemian works. I would say like, I don't know, artsy fartsy is, I think, the technical term.
We have a wide range of interests, I would say, and
yeah.
And not only passing interests, but it's going to be a pretty interdisciplinary magazine.
Yeah. Just some of the stuff that is in the first issue, for example, to give you a sense of like the range of it. There's a memoir of what it was like to be kind of at the center of the punk rock grunge music scene in New York in the 90s. There's an essay by our co-editor who wasn't able to join us today, Kyle Flannery, about how to decolonize board games. There's a an essay about like the biophysical economy and how it works, and how to distinguish the biophysical aspects of the economy from the more kind of nominal aspects of the economy. There's the definitive take on MMT, which kind of stretches from like critiques of some of their concepts, having to do with like international currencies, but also like ancient Mesopotamia and the origins of money there, at least in Eurasia, and like the consequences that has for economic theory. There's pharmacy poems written by a poet called Joey Grantham that he wrote while he was working at a kind of pharmacy, and you get the sense kind of in like a kind of rundown area, that he literally wrote on like the pharmacy scripts that they used for prescriptions, and so that gives you, I think, a sense of like the range of our interests. I mean, we're interdisciplinary, right? Steve's an economist, Francis is an architect, urban designer, and like visual designer. I'm a writer, but I've worn like a couple different hats as a writer. I've been like an art critic. I've been like a journalist. I've done like weird socialist political analysis. So we have several anthropologists, both Quinn and Kyle are have that kind of training, and so I think that gives you a sense of kind of like the range of things that we're working with here. I'm getting a question here. This was on my personal account. By the way, Francis, are you sure that you made it so anyone can DM us? Because the apparently.
Oh yes, I did.
Okay. Yeah.
As not going through.
Yeah, as of 10 minutes ago, somebody DM'd me saying that they couldn't DM the Strange Matters account. So if you can DM the Strange Matters account, that's at strange_matters on Twitter. Just shoot us a DM there, and we'll respond. But I have an initial question here, which is, how did we come up with the name?
Oh,
that's a fun story.
It's a fun story, but it's also not a fun story.
I actually have a mug here.
Yeah, oh wow, yeah, okay. That's a useful illustration of this kind of agony.
Yeah, let's see how to actually answer this.
Well, actually, I mean, why don't we just be honest?
Yeah, no, might as well. It's a funny story in retrospect.
It's a funny story. For a long time, our name was different. And then about 4 months ago, was it 4?
Yeah.
We had a meeting with the market. Well, through some means, we realized that actually we would run into trademarking issues if we continued with this name, and there was a high probability that, like, some people use trademarked names. There's a high probability that we would have been sued.
Right.
So we decided to change our name, and then we really had to really open up the conversation about what we all valued,
right?
What we wanted to convey with the name.
But so for clarity's sake, we were called A Going Concern before. That was our name. But then that didn't work out because of the trademark issue, and we were thrown into this crisis of oh my God, we have to redo all the branding, and then also what do we call ourselves, because it's such a big decision. So we ended up spending a month and a half just kind of doing soul searching as an editorial team. But thankfully, we have a very strong internal democratic process and a really, really great team of people. So we set up a process by which we went through all these I think it was literally over it ended up being either close to 100 or over 100, didn't it?
Oh, it was over 100.
It was over.
Yeah,
it was a crazy amount of names that we went through, and we actually ended up having to kind of sort them into a hierarchy based on our votes. It's literally it's an Excel spreadsheet. It's an artifact of our process. And Strange Matters kind of initially was it was in the top, but not the number one, but it was the one that consistently stayed there for a good for many, many weeks. And the more that we talked about it, the more we kind of started thinking of it as a default. And then it's well, maybe it could be this other thing, but Strange Matters is still pretty good. And then eventually just kind of settled
It
on
was
it.
like on the Tour de France, like there would be, I mean, it's the rider who's getting like third and fourth every single time and maybe wins a few. And like that's, you already know that's like more than enough to win the whole thing if you're in that range.
Right.
So
So,
it was always, it was never out of the conversation despite all of these other names.
but in terms of the name itself, which probably is more what the person had in mind rather
Yeah.
than trauma, uh, the I think that it has a number of different meanings. So, Steve, you, because like it kind of like developed its meanings through conversations in this process. But Steve, I'll throw it to you because for the initial thing, because you were the one who initially came up with it. So I was wondering.
Yeah. I mean, I'm kind of a physics nerd, so it was initially strange matter with no S. And that's what I threw onto the table, so to speak. And eventually we were like, how about we use S so that it's matters, so that it's like I think how I marketed it at first was like, it's something that magazine is going to be a space to examine something on its own terms. And it's something that's mysterious, that's on, it demands to be understood on its own terms and not imposed upon an existing model simply because that's the tool that you have to understand something. And so, okay, you have this strange thing, this strange matter. And so there's going to be multiple of those that we explore every single issue. So maybe to make it sound a bit more literary while still having the mysterious aspect of strange matter, which is a type of exotic matter in physics, it's going to be strange matters.
Yeah, and I think that one of the other meanings that kind of emerged out of our conversations was like, we have this little internal narrative. It's going to be part of our manifesto that comes out the day that we launch, like that talks about like what it means to create a space where you can develop like new ideas. And one of the stories that we're going to have in that manifesto is like, we have these like mental models of the world, and they're not reducible to like, different like, ways of knowing and how do we know what we know kind of questions. They're practical models of like what we think exists. And like, if I drop this coffee cup, I expect that it's going to go down because of a certain model that I have of the world and how things work and so on. And like, you live with that model all your life for a long time, but then you encounter some strange entity very often. I mean, this especially happens when you're doing any kind of like research into any really deep questions. Like you encounter some weird anomaly that doesn't make sense, that doesn't fit into the way that you think things of its sort should behave. And then you're kind of confronted with a choice, right? You can either like not you can either ignore it, right, and basically say, well, it was just like, it's just this weird one-off thing and happened purely by chance and I don't have to think about it, or even just like at a deeper level, just like pretend that it doesn't exist, right, and just keep it out of your mind. Or you can think, if this thing exists and it's insisting on its existence and it behaves in a way that doesn't fit at all with my model, maybe there's something wrong with my model. But then what kind of model could explain it? And once you do that, you're kind of like in this mode where you can do things like what Thomas Kuhn calls paradigm shifts in the history of science, right? Or what Lakatos, another philosopher of science, calls like escaping like a degenerated research program. And that's exactly the kind of thing that we want to do in the magazine. So, in a lot of ways, what we want to write about is these kind of strange matters, right? These strange subject matters, these strange topics, these strange phenomena out there in the world that don't really fit pre-existing conceptions. And rather than just kind of sweeping them under the rug, we actually want to talk about them and expose them and explore them. And in doing so, kind of rewrite the ideas that we have in our heads about, like, you know, how capitalism works, and what kind of things can replace it, or what kind of action makes sense for the left-wing movement, or even, like, you know, what kind of culture is worth making, what kind of art really speaks to our present conditions, you know, what kinds of things are going on in, like, the hard sciences, or you know, or in like, you know, economic history or other kind of academic disciplines that maybe kind of upends the frameworks that currently dominate those disciplines, and that kind of thing. So that's the kind of neighborhood that we ended up settling on in the meaning of the name.
And I would add to that that even if you go through that entire process and you're still left with this unknown something, that is, we'd also like to employ this other concept from a poet, John Keats, called negative capability, which is basically like the concept that, like, you can hold different seemingly contradictory ideas about something with no real resolution as to which way a model may explain something or not as you move forward through a scientific process of understanding. So it's like you're comfortable with there being an unknown quality even after you've gone through your process of observing something that is strange and saying, okay, well, we've explained some of its movements and its observed reality, but there's more work to be done. And, you know, you want to bring in more people to think along with you in a more egalitarian sort of methodology until you understand what this thing is.
So yeah, to jump in there, I mean, I think there is, each of us probably has our own, like, elements of each of us probably has our own interpretations of the name Strange Matters, or ideas that we think are most important to the meaning of Strange Matters as a name, but they sort of follow two pretty distinct lines, and one of them is about empiricism and, like, horizontality, and being open, and the other line is about thinking outside of the box, thinking outside of the ontologies that we are sort of embedded in, yeah, and an appreciation for heterodoxy.
Yeah, absolutely. The and yeah, I would also say that, like, part of it is that, like, especially when we were talking about, like, the hundreds of other titles that we were competing with, it has a little bit of a mystique to it, I think. Like, it's at least it's interesting because, like, there are people who knew us when we were still going concern, and when we announced the new title to them, like, a handful of them were like, oh, I like the old one better, but, like, most people were like, oh, that's such a better title. Because the feedback that we heard consistently was like, oh, it's like, you know, it's kind of mysterious. It makes you, like, wonder, like, Strange Matters, like, what could that be about? Like, it's like, what, strange how, like, you know, blah blah blah. So that was one of the kind of things also that kind of, so all that stuff is in the mix in terms of how we thought of it. So do we have any other questions in the Strange Matters DMs?
We don't yet. I actually did miss one configuration, so
okay,
so if anybody wants to try again.
So if you have Twitter, just go to @strange_matters. You should be able to DM us there now. If not, some of you follow me, so I'm at @red_dilettante. So if you follow me, ask me questions too. That's fine. I'll convey them to the group. Sorry that we're kind of janky on this. We were hoping that the Twitch stream would be relatively frictionless because it was when we tested it, but apparently not so much. I have a second question that came out of my DMs. I'm going to throw this one out to Steve a little bit. Will the economics pieces be from any one particular school of heterodox thought, or will it be a more wide-ranging set of approaches?
I would say it will be from a range of perspectives. I'm kind of, as I wrote my pieces, I was sort of figuring out my own perspective, sort of a blend of a few, but like you'll see ideas and citations from post-Keynesian economics, from Marxian economics, from institutional economics, a whole bunch of them that are associated with left-wing movements will certainly be in the mix. Like for my inflation piece, I put a couple different schools of thought into dialogue with one another as I work through the question of like, okay, why are people setting prices the way that they do? And like, what do we see them doing? And then here's what each group says. Okay, this is why they're doing this.
Yes. If I may add to that, I think that if we're being like totally brutally honest, the folks on the editorial committee who are interested in writing about economics probably have our foundations. Like if you had to pick a school, and the problem with heterodox economics, right, is that like anything outside of the neoclassical school, which for those who don't know the intellectual history, neoclassical economics is the supply and demand stuff that is taught like in all the mainstream economics departments pretty much. And which as the history of heterodox economics by Frederick S. Lee, a book that is really important, shows, the way that they got there was pretty much like through purging, and like rather than like them winning intellectual battles, it was them taking control of departments and journals and using it to purge anybody who disagreed with them, and then control the careers of any grad student who wanted to advance in the profession. So that leaves like everybody else, but that is both a very diverse field and also one whose boundaries are a little fuzzy at the edges, because like, you know, a lot of people from the institutionalist school are very deeply influenced by Marxism. A lot of the Marxists draw on concepts from other schools, including sometimes, and we don't like this very much, neoclassical ideas, because neoclassical stuff is pretty much bullshit. And a lot of people know this intuitively because of the kind of reception of economics since the 2008 crash, but like it's even worse than you imagined. And that's actually probably one of the main themes of the first issue's econ stuff, is all the different litany of flaws, like fundamental foundational flaws that cannot be fixed, you know, with the basic neoclassical paradigm. But then in terms of what to replace it with, like, you know, there was, for many decades, there wasn't actually like a coherent alternative, but a lot of us on the team are really influenced by this one guy, Frederick S. Lee, who wrote the book that I mentioned before, who, it's not that he got everything right, but he was a post-Keynesian / institutionalist / Marxian who kind of put together both the history of the field, which, believe it or not, nobody had really done in a coherent way, and like, you know, and at the level of detail that like PhDs can like talk about, but rather like he created this like germ of an alternative. Like, what is the best coherent ideas at the core of all the heterodox schools that create like a model of the economy as a whole? And it's not that like we're Leysians in like a narrow sense, because, you know, there are things that actually we disagree with Lee that are going to come out in at least the footnotes of some of the stuff in the first issue, and will probably come out later in other economic stuff. But the basic kind of stew that he put together makes a lot of sense. And we think that it can be expanded kind of beyond the initial synthesis that he did by adding in some stuff that he didn't talk about so much, such as, for example, feminist economics, ecological economics, particularly anything having to do with like biophysical production processes and their effects on ecological networks, supply chain management literature of the sort that, you know, Lee kind of talks about it, but he usually is talking about like pretty outdated sources from like the mid-century, and like, you know, a lot of stuff changed since the stuff that he was using as his main source, and also like a lot of it wasn't very hands-on, you know, so whereas like, you know, people who are practitioners, they learn how to actually plan the economy through supply chains. So if you mix all that together, you kind of end up with something that looks like a coherent vision of what the economy is, how it works, and how you can construct new things within it. And that's kind of, we don't have like a single ism for that yet, and maybe shouldn't, because we want to keep it open so that it can change in this way that we were talking about before. But you know, like that is roughly speaking the direction that we want to head in terms of our inquiry.
Yeah, I would add to that, like, or we're going to emphasize, I would say, like when we examine production, we're going to look at what are the practitioners doing? Like okay, the object of investigation, if it's a firm, is like, okay, there's a pricing manager, there's a supply chain manager. How are they ordering biophysical processes and managing their money? And then use what's a methodology that examines those empirical facts first, and then tries to construct a model around it that parsimoniously shows their behavior with as little slippage as possible. And as far as what schools of thought go into that thought process, it might look initially like I'm just sort of throwing a bunch of things together, kind of like JMC was saying, but I'm trying to always kind of center, like, okay, these are the people that are in charge of these processes for like setting the prices or setting the schedules of production or actually doing the production themselves, and go from there basically. And it might kind of look like a whatever works sort of approach is on the theory end, but it's not, though, because like there are important problems within the theorizing itself that we also get into. It's not only looking at like the practitioners and what they're doing, but I suppose if there's any bias right now in my work, it's like, okay, well, I'm pretty interested in the micro angle of things, and I'm also interested in the practitioner side of things, and then it kind of flows from there.
Yeah, to the extent that we can, like, you know, it's not just about like all these like discourses and disciplines that we're drawing upon. It's also like, are they grounded in some way, in some actual observable process that you can see in history or in just concrete observations, whether it's like academic ones like from anthropology or like non-academic ones like from journalism, right? Like that actually like are observable out there in the world. Because if you can ground theoretical concepts in those kinds of things, it's much more likely that they're not going to be bullshit kind of deductive models based on axiom first principles that you thought up in an armchair. And in fact, a lot of the non-bullshit economic theories have a lot of things in common, and those things that are in common tend to be things that are grounded in observables. So that's kind of like the general intuition that guides us in a lot of ways.
Yeah, but at the same time, though, like there's important problems to be worked out in the intellectual history that just needs to be revealed, like neoclassicals just freaking purging people from universities. I mean, that had important effects on its own,
right? Of course,
on how people understand things, and then how the business world operates through kind of knowing itself through economics.
Right. If you really want to kill economics, you first have to kind of reveal its hidden history, and then you have to build a better mousetrap, build a better theoretical framework that can actually predict and explain things like the 2008 crash or the current inflation, rather than like simply making excuses for why us saying that it was impossible before it happened was actually us being brain geniuses, you know, or something like that.
Absolutely.
So we have another question, a follow-up. Will the magazine contain reviews? Will these be non-fiction books, fiction, other media, etc.? Just curious.
Oh, that's awesome. You want to field this one, Francis?
Yeah. We have 3 reviews in the, well, depending on how you count them. We have 3 reviews in the first issue. One of them is a recurring piece called The Triple, which takes 3 pieces of media and talks about them in a dialogue. In the first issue, there are 3 different pieces of media in a single genre, so cyberpunk, and it'll be comparing Cyberpunk 2077, Devs, the TV series, and Machine's Last Testament, which is a novel by Ben-Ewan Skirdakiu.
I think that Elizabeth said that it was called, her name was pronounced Sarandicu, if I remember. But I don't know if that was just Elizabeth's pronunciation, though.
Right. Yeah. She's from Thailand, so yeah, we really ought to sort out her pronunciation so we're not offensive. But anyway, yeah, so that's one of the reviews, or the triple review for the first issue. There's also a review of Wesley Yang's collection of essays, The Souls of Yellow Men, that considers his sort of long, slow and steady demise, his yeah, as a public essayist. And then the third review is of a board game. Remind me if I'm forgetting anything, James E. and Steve.
Oh, no, the Barry Jenkins one. That was
yes.
Yeah, Jen's essay on the Barry Jenkins film.
Yes. We have an essay on If Beale Street Could Talk, and on Barry Jenkins' cinematic technique. And then we also have another piece looking at several board games that are kind of civilization builder board games, and considering them in relation to colonialism, which is quite exciting. So yes, multimedia, many reviews, very exciting to read, speaking personally.
And I would say that's one of my goals in the back pages, as we're calling it. So we have the magazine as a whole is divided into the front pages and the back pages, where the front pages has this kind of like the libertarian socialist research program that we kind of were talking about before, where we want to create these tools that we can use to have a better framework for acting in the world, whether that's like political theory or political economy, or or some combination of those. But then the back pages, we want to be a much more open and free space for the exploration of art, science, philosophy, and journalism in general. And we really want it to be a rather open field, not necessarily people who always agree with us on everything politically, although certainly excluding people who are like, involved in fascist or other authoritarian movements, but essentially, like we want to have a space where people can do this kind of like radical interdisciplinary sort of exploration. The Wesley Yang essay is in some ways the kind of thing that you would find in a magazine like N+1 in its prime, or the Los Angeles Review of Books, because it deals with like an essayist who was, had very public renown a few years ago, and then kind of like devolved into this like, intellectual dark web adjacent Twitter personality, right? So you can kind of like see how a magazine that's like an intellectual magazine would take interest in tracing the decline of his career and also of his like aesthetic projects. But then like the board game piece for me is the sort of thing that those magazines would never do, partly because they don't take generally they despite like a lot of like verbiage about like how culture ought to be democratic and all this other stuff, don't take things like board games or video games or things like that seriously as works of art, or as cultural objects that can be analyzed in like a really deep way. And I think that this is part of the advantage of our approach, is that we're really interested in putting people with different training and different backgrounds and different interests in conversation with each other. And we think it's really exciting to have those kinds of conversations all be happening within the same magazine. and have Barry Jenkins' adaptation of a James Baldwin novella, which a lot of people would kind of read in a narrowly sort of political way, actually be given this like really deep formalistic analysis of the sort that you normally would only see in something done by like a film student or something like that. And in fact, the person who wrote it is Jun Kuromiya is in fact a filmmaker who went to film school, but also like does that formalistic analysis in a way that any ordinary reader can understand. So I think that's like all really, really cool. And I want to do more, personally, I want to see more of that happen, and especially with an eye towards like, the international scene. And having writers publish from like different countries, especially like, poets, novelists, etc. And also kind of like, in my dream world, like with an eye towards like a global literary and philosophical canon, right? Like, not having people write about like Ibn Khaldun or Ngugi wa Thiong'o or something like that. So that would be the dream. Although of course, in the first issue, we've got what we've got, which I think is pretty good.
JMC, do you have any more in your DMs?
I do not.
I've got one incoming here. Ha. Jack's just vibing has sent us another question. Is there a timetable for when the magazine is going to launch? Will publication be sporadic or regular?
Good question.
Steve, do you want to take it?
Sure. So our fundraiser launch is on March 1st. Our website and its digital content will be up then. As for the print issues, I would say, so we're going to get, well, issue 1, obviously this year. We're thinking about getting a second issue, depending on how the fundraiser goes this year as well. We'll see about that. But it's going to be a quarterly magazine. That much we hope to get started. We hope to get 4 issues in the following year, assuming everything goes well financially. And yeah, it's got each quarterly issue will be roughly 300 pages. Yeah.
I forget if Steve covered this, but between issue releases, we'll be publishing digital only pieces. So there'll be a somewhat steady stream of content on the website, and the issues will be published at regular intervals. Obviously, in the first year, we can't we need to get our footing financially before we can, and obviously have a readership. But we aim to eventually publish 2 or 3 times a year, maybe more. But like maybe we'll publish a second issue in the first year. That would be wonderful, actually.
Yeah, so you can expect regular content on the website between those issues this year, certainly. There'll be a blog, and then there'll be longer essays coming out.
Yeah, and I would also say that we want to build up to the level of a quarterly, intellectual magazine, which generally is like, even though it says quarterly, it's usually more like 2 or 3 times a year. In the first year, we're looking at probably like 1 or 2 issues, and then like, trying to like ramp up from there. But in between any print issue, there will always be a continual stream of content, both in terms of like online essays and also like podcast is in the works. We're thinking about a model for YouTube content, although that's going to be kind of, hopefully once we have the money for it, we can like expand and like in that direction. That's one of the first directions that we want to look at, and other kinds of stuff that would be coming out on a continual basis. So just in other words, basically just like any other magazine. that you would subscribe to, we would be trying to produce at roughly that rate.
Mhm.
I actually have another question here that came in on my DMs. And now I can't find my DMs column. Here we go. Kind of curious about how Strange Matters is thinking about the relationship between capitalism and literary production in general, but also specifically with how y'all publish. So that's a fantastic question. Thanks for that. There's a lot of angles here that we could take, but I don't know where we want to start with that. So what's the relationship between capitalism and literary production, especially like for us?
Well, we aim to pay our writers fairly and as much as possible, which is one element of our, I mean, we're really attempting to live our politics. So the magazine is a worker cooperative. We all own it equally, all 5 of us, although we're, it's just 3 of us on this AMA. And we all contribute equally. Actually, none of the editors are paid at this point in time, but once the fundraiser is, we won't be paid coming out of the fundraiser either. We're making it a priority to pay our writers like at a very competitive rate, if not above market rate, and potentially to pay them more over time. As far as other elements of the business are concerned, I think the aim is over time to work with as many democratic cooperative business partners as possible. So we hope in the future to work with a cooperative printer. We'll be promoting a sort of network of cooperatives in the coming months on our website, who gave us our URL, our .coop URL. Anybody else want to pitch in here?
Can I go? Or?
Yeah, you go first.
Yeah, so our Strange Matters itself is a worker co-op, like Francis said. We all have equal ownership and control. Internally, we exercise, right now we're operating on a consensus model for pretty much all our decisions. And we want to integrate our supply chain as much as possible into being only working with other worker cooperatives who similarly exercise democratic decision-making, ownership and control. And kind of, so our domain provider, so they're why we have the .coop domain, and they actually inspect our legal documents to ensure that that actually is the case. So there's some verification there, in case you're wondering. And we, as far as the editorial work and our own writing, it all goes through the same editorial process. So like if I have an idea to write a paper, it goes through the same process as an outside writer, etc. It's the same level of quality. And our production and our editorial work concerning outside writers is totally democratic and worker cooperative oriented. And our writers, we want them to be paid above market rate, like as a rule. That'll obviously depend on how well the fundraiser goes and how further subscriptions go. But that's our clear aspiration, and we're sticking to it. Like we're not taking no taking salaries. This has been sweat equity so far,
right?
In order to pay them what they're worth, which is a lot. And we're very grateful for outside contributors.
Right, and we're also planning on providing resources to writers who haven't yet published, on how to get published. James C., do you want to elaborate?
Well, yes, but oh man, I have a lot to say on
You can follow your other train of thought first. Go for it.
Yeah, it's a tough question because there's so much that you can say about it. I think that the approach that I want to take to answering the question is kind of starting with my own experience, right? Because I'm a freelancer who tried to make it as a writer and has published stuff, but like, I don't pay my rent with it, right? And that's the situation. Like, I know from personal experience, and other people on the team know from their personal experience in other fields besides writing, that like capitalism is set up in such a way as to prevent anything that doesn't guarantee some bottom line for some absentee owner from really being able to spread and fund itself. And that's just like the nature of the beast. If you're interested in doing something, not because it'll generate a bunch of like ad revenues or affiliate marketing deals, but because it's a good in and of itself, but it requires like high skill, or high skill in the sense of like, not like some people are better than others, but high skill in the sense of like a long training in something like reporting, for example. And sending people out across to the other side of the world in order to send back reports about the who, what, where, when, why of what's happening. Like all of that, the more that capitalists have sunk their teeth into these endeavors, the more that they cut all of that back in favor of basically just like talking heads, like pontificating about sensationalized versions of news stories that were reported by somebody else in order to drive up like outrage and or sell you like weird body pills, if it's like an Alex Jones kind of thing. So I think that like as a result of that, having some kind of like alternative is really important, and being able to build that alternative up out of in what is initially like a relatively small space, but then growing it out beyond that is really important. And I think that part of what the magazine is staking its kind of like putting its chips on the table for. No, that's the wrong analogy. Sorry. Part of our skin in the game is that we're making a gambit that cooperative enterprise, not just on the level of the single firm, but like, networked between firms into like a solidarity economy, is a way that we can create a socialist sector of the economy, wherein not only is production more democratic, but the kinds of production that take place actually meet people's needs, rather than just being about guaranteeing profit for some owners who don't even participate in production, but just extract rent based on their ownership of the capital. So that's the general kind of like philosophy, I would say, that motivates a lot of what we're doing. And then everything that we do on the practical level has to do, is kind of downstream of those kinds of convictions. So for example, like we are ourselves a democratic cooperative and want eventually like our supply chain to be made up of democratic printer, democratic distribution network, like et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. In other words, other cooperatives. Well, the stuff that we're publishing, like for example, the essay on the Black cooperative economy by Jessica Gordon-Emhart, who's a great economist and historian of the Black cooperative movement. Like we want to publish things that are resources that will help people build their own democratic institutions, whether again it's cooperatives or things like tenants unions and syndicalist trade unions or neighborhood councils or other kind of organs of radical direct democracy, independent of capitalists and the state. Like we want the ability to create art in terms that are not necessarily the the highly kind of like capitalistic way in which it's done in legacy media, or the more kind of petty capitalist way in which it's done in alternative media. And I have this long interview that I did with C. Derek Varn about like the political economy of the media ecosystem, which I'm trying, part of my hesitation here is that I'm trying desperately not to get into that whole conversation, because that was like a 2-3 hour conversations that I had with him. But if you're interested in that, you can find me talking to on what's called the Varn vlog on YouTube about that at length. But the gist of it is that, I would say, sorry, this has been a long response, but just to cut it off, like what we're trying to do is build up an alternative form of production that is radically democratic and that does not operate on capitalist principles to the greatest extent possible. Obviously, we're currently embedded within a capitalist system, but the more that we grow out a counter system, the more free we are from those limitations. And that's kind of the gambit that we're making in all the practical things that Francis and Steve discussed.
Check our DMs again.
Yeah, so just a reminder for folks, if you have questions, send them to we now have open DMs. So if you go to on Twitter to strange_matters with an S, that'll get you to our account, and you can just shoot us a DM with your question. And sorry again that we have to do it indirectly. I don't know why the Twitch stream is acting up.
So we have another question. So curious, how do the editors know one another? University? And the answer is partially yes, partially no. Largely through New York networks of like socialists. I know JMC from university. Yeah.
It's complicated because we all met each other kind of at different stages. So it's this kind of, it wasn't like we all met at once. It was like these little links, and we had our own networks, and then the networks kind of merged. And then, you know, if you did the graph of it, it would look really complicated.
Well, there's a conspiracy board that's it's out of view right now, but it connects everything.
Yeah.
Little red pieces of string.
Yeah.
I mean, I have a tack board, but you just can't see
it. Let's see if we can summarize.
James and I were in an arts collective together.
Right.
But we knew each other before then, though.
Yeah. So
I'm South African, and I met JMC through a South African friend of mine who was at the same university.
Right. So we met in college, and then I met Steve. I think that's the next link here. I met Steve through DSA stuff, because we were organizing. I was organizing the Libertarian Socialist Caucus and the Housing Committee, and then I think there was like local, if I remember correctly, I mean, it was a while ago, but there was like local controversies in New York over like endorsements and things like that. And there were like these Facebook groups where people would talk about that. And there was also like political education stuff going on around like MMT stuff. And I think that we met online.
It was like a discussion on MMT within the NYC DSA chapter.
It was something like that. Yeah.
And like that, I don't know. I forget if you messaged me or what.
Yeah, it must have been something like that.
It was from something like that, yeah.
And then we went on like a little coffee date, and we became friends, and then we just kind of like started like conspiring together as one is wont to do in DSA politics. And then the I guess another big leap was when the LSC kind of with the Stephanie Kelton affair. That was another big like organizing thing that we did together, along with a whole bunch of other people in the LSC.
This is like 2018,
something like that. Yeah, if I recall correctly. So that was us. And then you knew Carl. I actually knew Quinn separately from you. So actually, I knew Quinn because we were both in the Brooklyn, at the time, North Brooklyn Political Education Working Group of the DSA, and then we worked together on some meeting procedure like that actually ended up kind of going semi-viral. I'm very proud of it. It's just a Google Doc that's one page of like how to run a meeting, but it turns out that if you make a resource like that and drop it in group chats, people will cling to it and use it. So Quinn and I, we did that, and then that's how we became friends. And then how did you know Quinn? Was it through Deb?
I was in a working group of the NYC DSA chapter called the Debt and Finance Working Group, and the three of us were at various times on the board of that, basically. And so it was organizing through that group.
And what did you guys do on the Debt and Finance working group, just for the listeners?
We did various things, like we did a campaign to get signatures to get postal banking back for New York State. So we did like a lot of outreach for that. We did research on the feasibility of a state bank, like a publicly owned state bank for New York. That made its way over to some of our contacts in Albany, so there's some traction on that.
And also the white paper on the possibility of a DSA credit union, right? That was a big.
Yeah. So we did have an idea of setting up a credit union specifically for either the NYC DSA chapter or at the state level for just DSA residents of New York.
Yeah.
So we did kind of like a feasibility study, basically.
Yeah. And the answer was that it was feasible, but not it was feasible for all practical technical purposes, but politically it was dead in the water because the social democrats at the top of NYC DSA were not particularly interested in that sort of thing. So I was slightly involved. I was tangentially involved with that. So it's a
JMC was a member of the Debt and Finance Working Group.
Yes. The albeit a late and not particularly loyal member, because I was always dragged away by the Bronx Upper Manhattan Political Education Committee and other obligations. But anyway, and then Kyle was also Debt and Finance, right? That was
yes.
Yeah.
So Kyle and Quinn were both there. That's how I met both of them, actually.
And then Francis and I also have another link, which is that we were both involved in the Symbiosis Federation of the North American Libertarian Socialist Federation of like neighborhood councils and municipalist groups and cooperative groups that are trying to kind of create dual power institutions, as it's called, independent institutions with resources under the direct democratic control of parts of the working class. All across North America. And Francis, I believe you designed their logo, right? If I recall correctly, the tentacles.
Yes. It's a protea. It's a type of flower, but it's abstracted a little. So yeah, I don't know. It's supposed to imply like pluralism and beauty and all sorts of things.
Well, it does. It's very beautiful. I just call it the tentacles because I forget what animal it is.
It's not an animal. It's a flower. It's called a protea.
I'm real ecological. I know the nature. I'm very good at nature and things.
Nature and things.
Yeah.
This is the kind of articulate writing you can expect from the magazine.
You're gonna be
expect more of this.
Yeah, you're gonna be getting like real articulate essays that talk just like that. So that's why you should give us money. No, but yeah, so that's another connection with us because not all, but some of the core organizers of Symbiosis initially were kind of in our little college groupuscule, and then so that kind of like, so Francis did a lot of design for like the visual assets of Symbiosis. I kind of helped in the early stages with like networking it with some people who I met through DSA type organizing and getting them on board, as well as like the sum of, not not whole because I was busy doing LSC stuff, but like I lent a little bit of a hand for the setup of the initial Congress as well, for Symbiosis, which was a big continental Congress that had people from. It had Zapatistas from Mexico. It had North American, like Canadian, Quebecois, and other municipalists and cooperative groups, and it had like American groups like Cooperation Jackson, and they all showed up, and that was kind of like the founding in-person Congress of Symbiosis. So that's that branch of our organizing. So hopefully what that says, this wasn't really the question, but I think it would be cool for people to know that like we have all been like very heavily involved in the socialist and anarchist movements that have emerged in North America since like Occupy Wall Street and the Trump election. So like we have on the ground movement experience, and part of the way that cashes out in terms of our content is that we would really like our political and journalistic coverage to be on the ground stuff about stuff that's actually going on, either written by or interviewing and covering, people who have actually engaged in, direct action or in the construction of these socialistic institutions like tenants unions and syndicalist unions and neighborhood councils, mutual aid, community energy, blah, 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 cooperatives, all that stuff, because, that's been our experience and we have not seen it covered to the same degree as we would like in the mainstream socialist publications, which either tend to take like a heavily electoralist approach in the case of like magazines like Jacobin or Current Affairs, or which in the cases of like, BreadTube and like the podcast ecosystem are oftentimes very, very obsessed with kind of their own like media sphere and its gossip and, who's having a feud with who and that kind of thing. And much less with like these on the ground movements of people who are trying to construct real autonomy for the working classes of North America. So that's basically like what we would like to do, is to create an alternative that is very much grounded in those movements and in their practical experience and in their practical questions, right? Because those movements oftentimes run into walls where they don't know exactly what they ought to do or what they should do, and having a space where we can talk that stuff out would significantly enhance our ability to come up with solutions that work.
So yeah, we do have another question. Will the politics be focused primarily on the US and English-speaking countries, or will it attempt a more international perspective?
International. Yeah, I mean, we don't. We'd prefer not to be like have like a provincial focus for sure.
So speaking as an international person, our first issue is focused on American political economy, but the explicit aim of the magazine is to become more international. I mean, we do have actually we had several features lined up for the first issue that fell through that were explicitly international. But they'll probably come in issue 2. So yeah, my attitude and the position that I regularly sort of defend in the group, or like push in the group, is that we need to be as international as possible. And yeah, so
yeah,
you should expect that.
Although we don't have explicitly internationalist articles in the first issue 1, like you said, there will be ones in issue 2 when it comes out. But there are sections of essays where we certainly consider international themes. Like we'll have in a piece on the history of chartalism, like the intellectual movement which gave rise to MMT and those economists of today. We have like a section on economic development where we consider developing economies and like their strategies of development, like how well do MMT's ideas how would they be served by them, you know, and like, yeah.
And similarly, in one of our editorials about libertarian socialism, although it does have a heavy US focus, it also tries to kind of do this synoptic view of the development of libertarian socialist movements around the world, starting with the Zapatista uprising in '94, and then moving through like the anti-globalization movement and the rise of like, and after the Rojava Revolution, the rise of like libertarian socialist groups that were like inspired by it, like Cooperation Jackson and all these other different kinds of groups. Which does take you far afield to the United States if you trace that history. And although it's something that we were able to do more in the footnotes or in like the kind of like side digressions of the essays of this one, because like we had like writers from outside the United States who were gonna do stuff with us, but then unfortunately it just kind of logistically fell through. Although hopefully at least one of them will be in the next issue. But aspirationally from the very beginning, we've definitely wanted to escape from the black hole, which is the provincialism of the United States, totally self-absorbed and obsessed culture with itself, unable to look beyond its borders and understand itself in relationship to stuff that's happening, even if it's directly related to stuff that's happening here. So hopefully we will not fall into that trap and disappear over the event horizon, and instead we'll kind of like, you know, expand beyond the US. Although, you know, part of it is that we need your help, you know, to the extent that you guys out there are writers or know people who are writers and stuff from different countries and have these connections, send them our way. We want them. We want to be able to hear these different perspectives. You know, and if you yourself maybe are like, you know, an American, but you have academic or intellectual interests that take you to whether it's like, you know, to medieval India or to you know, or to 20th century post-colonial Africa or whatever, like send those pictures our way too. Because that's all of this stuff is stuff that we want to write about in a way that is as natural and as obviously of interest to our audience as anything that we would write about, like, you know, American politics or something like that. So we're an hour and a half into this. I'm not seeing any more questions. Maybe
See.
Either of you received any in your DMs, your personal DMs?
No.
Yeah, I have not. So
we could chat more about some of the contents of issue 1, what we have lined up.
Yeah.
I mean, we could talk beyond reviews in the back pages. We have a really like interesting and curious piece called Permanent Handstamp by Robin Eisgrau, who was a prominent editor in the music magazine scene in the 90s. And it's this piece that reflects on her time in the industry and how the industry has changed and how music has changed since then. And it's like fascinating in its sort of like political and economic insights, and also has this like curious and enticing mixture of like nostalgia that like really draws one in. And I'll hand it over to somebody else to chat about another piece or elaborate.
Well, but Eisner's piece is kind of, I like it because it's kind of like a mixture of like gossip, nostalgia, and also like the supply chain realities of being of being a 90s indie music reporter / essayist. And oh, and also just having odd jobs within the industry outside of writing.
Yeah, she's got the this wonderful way of like mixing together the fact that she like knew every single band apparently of the 90s, and apparently like has like gossipy little anecdotes about each and every one of them, while also kind of like telling you how the sausage was made at a magazine like 16 magazine, you know, which produced content for teenage girls having to do with the music industry. And you know, the very strict content and editorial guidelines for how they produce that content, and things like that, and also the kind of like economics of the you know, the relationship with the record labels to the music press to the musicians and stuff like that. And you know, it's interesting because like if I were to tell Robin, like, you know, you wrote this like wonderful essay that talks about the political economy of the music industry, she would be like, what? No, I didn't. I just wrote about my life. And that's one of these wonderful things that we found with some of the essays in this issue that I at least personally would like to really encourage in future essays. People writing about their own lives and their own work experiences have far more insight, like orders of magnitude more insight than most PhD economists into how the economy actually works. Even when they don't think that they're talking about economics, just because it turns out that by asking people, hey, how was this done anyway, right? Like, how was, to take a really random example, how was the video game Halo 2 developed anyway, right? This like big phenomenon for gamers who are about my age, because when we were like teenagers it came out, and it was one of the first big blockbuster games that had a bigger release you know, revenue wise than all the box office hits in the movies, right? Which was kind of like put video games on the map. How was that made? Turns out if you look at the story of how it was made, which has like come out in interviews and stuff since then, like, you know, they were under extreme crunch pressure for a deadline that Microsoft imposed on them, and they were like, you know, which is one of the horrible kind of like sweatshop aspects of labor in the AAA games industry, that is very common. And they, you know, there are still lawsuits pending for the fact that they didn't pay the musicians who composed the very famous Halo soundtrack and all this other kinds of stuff. But then also, like, you know, there's a lot of people who take pride in having designed very small individual elements of the game, you know, like even something like the physics engine or something like that. And then they'll talk with like much love and care about that work that they did like 10 years ago as like the stuff that they're proudest of in their lives. And you get to learn how these like highly specialized teams worked together, oftentimes around the backs of management, you know, in order to accomplish these things. You know, as I say this, I feel like we should like commission an essay about the production of Halo 2. This is just like stuff that I was reading the other night. But you know, like, so my point is like, just people talking about their life experience shows you so much about the world. And it's so odd, I think, that magazines run by radical leftists who supposedly want to democratize production and investment demonstrate so little interest in how production actually works and takes place in all these different industries. And it would be nice, I think, to have a space where, just as a natural and organic part of the way that we write about culture and philosophy and everything else, we're also writing about its method of production and the people who produce it and what motivates them and what limits them, especially under a capitalist system, and how they do the things they do. So that's something that I think I, at least as an editor, would be very interested in the future, not as like special features or anything, but just as like a natural part of the way that the magazine talks about stuff.
Yeah. Sorry, I have another question. And I assume that came to an end there.
Yeah. That was
okay. Cool. This question is, what would you say the average length of each piece is? I'm under the impression they're generally fairly long form. Yeah. And yes, they are.
Yeah,
they are typically pretty long.
we have the data on that somewhere.
Do we?
Yeah, I wouldn't know. We would know. We literally have the average somewhere.
Oh wow! Wait, why?
I don't know. This was just like, so one of us was dicking around in Google Sheets.
Oh, okay, cool. I don't think I was privy to that. That's really funny. It would actually be funny if we could produce a number, but
I can't find it right now, but although there are some very long ones, there are also like brief ones as well.
So I've been typesetting them, and in the print, the shortest so far is about 15 pages. But there is a section in the middle between the front and back pages called the futon, which is a play on feuilleton, the old sort of short piece section of old-fashioned newspapers, but we've retrofitted it to be futon because we're like, I don't know, quasi college students.
Yeah.
And this will feature much shorter pieces in the range of 500 to 800 words, about 5 or so. We haven't nailed down a number for issue 1, but yeah, they're typically pretty long. The average, I'd say, is about 18 to 20 pages, but there's some much longer pieces too. One of the pieces that we had planned for issue 1 expanded so much in the writing process that we're planning on potentially releasing it as a book.
Yeah, that was the MMT one. That ended up becoming basically a book project. That tentative title, what was it? Money, Power, and Socialism, I think.
Yep.
Yeah. Coming soon to a bookstore near you, at least if we can sell it to an agent. And extracts from that will be the series of essays that we're doing about MMT. But yeah, like it's interesting because so little magazines, like, I mean, not to put them on the spot, but I've got my issue of The Point here. They tend to have long form essays around, like, or London Review of Books, which I've got laying around here somewhere too. They'll tend to have essays that are like 5,000 to 7,000 words, or even as long as like 10,000 to 20,000 words. In the case of like a Perry Anderson opus that shows up every now and then in the LRB. New Left Review as well. So we're like kind of in that category where we want to have to be the kind of space that publishes stuff that would be too long for your typical publication, because there has to be a space for that kind of thing, because sometimes it does take that length to actually really get into the meat of things, and talk about things in a serious way. But at the same time, we want everything to be written kind of in a style, at least this is the style that we've been shooting for in our internal writing, and a lot of our writers have just matched it without even us telling them to. Written in a way that the ordinary person can understand, who's a non-specialist but is a curious, open-minded person, almost as if your friend who's like really smart and is like a specialist in some field were explaining it to you over coffee, right? In like this kind of like gossipy way, sometimes throwing in funny stories, sometimes like having a little digression about something that they've been thinking about lately, with this kind of like feeling of a back and forth, so that by the end of it, about something that you've never heard about before, but at a depth that allows you to follow, if you do pursue the footnotes and go into like, the actual journalistic or scholarly or whatever literature, like the actual like discourse and debates and controversies. And then you can kind of make up your own mind about whether the writer's right or whether they're kind of full of it. So that's the ideal, I think, is, democracy doesn't mean watering things down because of the assumption that the reader is stupid. It means giving the reader the tools to, having heard what the writer has to say and being able to look at the footnotes, follow, go from a place where they don't know anything about something to where they have a general story about something. And then if they choose, being able to pursue that knowledge and then figure out whether they agree or disagree and make up their own mind and maybe even do their own research. So that's kind of the attitude of the magazine, and the length of stuff and the number of footnotes that we have. We have a lot of footnotes. We have so many footnotes that Francis designed a special format for them, so that instead of being at the bottom of the page, they're actually kind of like these sidebars. It
occupies almost a third of the page, the footnote bar. Well, slightly less than that, but they're nice juicy footnotes too, you know. They're
Yeah.
not just extraneous detail. Therefore, like, if you are actually interested in reading the resources, it's like really great orientation to the arguments.
Yeah. And frankly, I think that, like, you know, there's a lot of people who are like, oh, well, that's going to be too scholarly for your typical reader. But I actually find that, especially when Francis lays them out that way, it actually looks more friendly and more accessible than something that is kind of like playing these little games where it's alluding to stuff without actually like telling you where to look, because it's saying like, well, the people who believe this, here's some of them, you can go and read them for yourself, you know, like I mean, this is kind of my if I sound like I have a chip on my shoulder, it's because I sometimes had to deal with editors who you know, who had an attitude that, like, you know, this stuff would scare readers away. But I think readers are really smart, you know, especially like people who are like looking for answers to these really urgent questions, or who really care deeply about like poetry and art and philosophy. They're smart, and they want that kind of depth. And I think that it's we would differentiate ourselves as a magazine by giving people those tools, because I think it's a tool of empowerment ultimately, to allow people to kind of like, you know, get astride these discourses and be able to, you know, to defend themselves if they had to get into a conversation about them.
And a follow-up to that question was, are there any are there any magazines we consider to be, what was the exact phrasing, take as a standard candle in terms of quality and content?
Oh boy.
Do you want to field this one again, Jamesy?
Well, I have mine for sure. I mean, I'm biased because I'm a writer, but well, I would be remiss if I didn't mention The Point, not just because I'm a lit editor for them on and off, but also because I genuinely admire them in terms of like the breadth of their content, in terms of their commitment to a democratic notion of the ordinary reader, kind of along the lines of what I was describing before, and also just like the way that they spoil their writers. I mean, I wrote Dictatorship of the Present for them, which is an essay that I'm very proud of about the rise of millennial socialism. And they gave me like 50 pages to say what I had to say. And it was an incredible opportunity. It's still one of the things that I'm most proud of as a writer. And they were extremely supportive throughout that process. So I really like them. I think that they're kind of a gold standard. I think that the London Review of Books is equally incredible. I mean, they're basically like the greatest literary intellectual magazine in the UK, and it's not a very controversial opinion. I think the New Left Review probably is for a certain kind of like, you know, Mandarin academic Marxist is another touchstone. I don't share that politics 100%, but NLR was very, very influential on me. And then like, you know, and like something like The Caravan in India, especially on the journalistic side, is, I mean, they do incredible investigative journalism while also publishing, you know, more like philosophical or essayistic or literary writers like Arundhati Roy and stuff like that. So those are like touchstones for me. And then other magazines that I like in the little magazine scene in the US include like, you know, The Baffler, the Los Angeles Review of Books, M+1, and things like that. That's kind of the category as I see it. I don't know. What do you guys read?
Your list pretty much encompasses mine, but what sticks out to me is like the London Review of Books and N+1 are kind of you want a standard candle, like I suppose like a mix of those ones for me. Yeah, there will be like New Left Review type essays occasionally, like well, I really like Perry Anderson, and I just like his he'll give you kind of like a world spanning accounting of, you know, where capitalist hegemony is and is heading, like that's been kind of an inspiration. But like it'll be kind of like, if I had to pick two, yeah, London Review of Books and N+1.
And since you mentioned N+1, I would just say as another exemplary writer is Elif Batuman, who unfortunately she hasn't written much recently that I know of, but back in the day, she would write these essays about Russian literature, some of which were later collected into her book, The Possessed. And she would talk about like going to a conference of like, scholars of, I don't know, like Tolstoy or something like that. But it actually would be like super loaded, not just because of like the gossip about like the conference and the politics of the people there, but also about like the deep seriousness with which they took literature. And then she would just do like this like offhand literary criticism of the actual texts that they were talking about. And it would all be like mixed together with this enormous erudition, but also like this playfulness, and this juicy gossip and the hilarity. She has a wonderful sense of humor. And as far as like cultural essays go, like for me, she and like Rebecca Solnit are like the gold standard. And even like writers in political economy who I like David Graeber, for example, oftentimes in my sense is that they mimic that style in like political economy. So that's the kind of thing for me. Francis, what are your
Yeah, I mean, I feel like you've both covered all our bases, but I think I'd like to expand on tone a little bit. And I think something all the editors agree on, and James, you touched on this or expanded on this really, is that we'd like for the tone to be as direct, empowering, but also delightful and to have a sort of warm and intimate tone. Of course, it'll be rigorous and relatively academic in that we'll have footnotes and we'll be making quite sophisticated arguments, but ultimately it'll be playful in a sense. Yeah. And on that note, like, I think there are some, I think on that note in particular, we'll be differentiating ourselves from other magazines in how dedicated we will be to that tone. And it'll flow into the graphical style of the magazine, and into all sorts of elements of the magazine as a whole. So that's my 2 cents.
Yeah, no, that's really important. That's very, very important. It's important, I think, that we don't come off like a lot of socialists do, frankly, as like haranguing people with these kind of spittle spewing pamphleteering. And I can pamphleteer with the best of them, right? But like, at the end of the day, I think that that's a less compelling aesthetic. Also, like the kind of like bitterness that you see around like more kind of doomerist stuff, where like people who are tending towards being doomers adopt this kind of nihilism, this bile, this bitterness, and this cynicism, like reflexive cynicism. There's a lot to be cynical about for sure, but like a reflexive cynicism towards anybody who claims to believe in something or to be trying to make the world better in any kind of respect, right? That also is not a very desirable aesthetic. And the kind of like more sophisticated than thou, snarkiness and knowingness that you oftentimes see among more kind of literati types, that in the kind of like the more literary intelligentsia, that's not necessarily very good either. So this tone of playfulness and delight and irreverence towards authority, but also a kind of respect for being able to reconstruct the debates that have been going on in a way that makes them more coherent to somebody who wasn't privy to them, like while also having like a certain gossipiness and a certain like sense of just like the beauty of language and the beauty of ideas that comes across in the way that we describe things, and particularly the things and people that we admire. That is all like really important to creating an ethos in which you can, I think, construct something new. Because I think that that's the kind of attitude that you have to have, not this kind of like worship, reverence of the past or of the great thinkers or whatever, but neither also this kind of like cynicism or cleverness or whatever, but this kind of like more playful, delightful, beautiful way of engaging with people, with ideas, and with works of art.
Yeah. I think each of us has a somewhat different way of articulating basically the same tone. Like mine is sort of like, it's like, we're going to have kind of a DIY, not
Open source.
not overly hopeful, neither overly hopeful nor doomer, but rather, I don't know, like self-sufficient sort of way of going
Pragmatic?
about things. Yeah, no, that sounds wrong. Yeah, I don't know. Like there's a place for doomers in our magazine, I guess, but it's like they have a weird hopefulness about them
Yes.
all the same.
Yes, I actually I feel bad.
This is hard to like articulate, but like doomers, you're like, well, let's give this a shot.
Yes,
Like,
I feel bad for having made fun of doomers. Thank you, Steve, for pointing that out, because I definitely do. I mean, I am a doomer in some ways. I'm like 60%.
I mean, aren't we all?
Yeah, exactly. It's like, I'm like 60% convinced that we're probably fucked. But you have to give it the old college try, and you have to laugh about it, because otherwise you just break down, right? Like, it's and you never know, right? You don't know better than history. History has this weird way of, something that was impossible 5 minutes ago, suddenly history happens, and now, like, 5 minutes later, not only is it possible, but it's actually like urgently necessary. So I think that like the a sense of humor and a certain playfulness, despite the dead seriousness of the topics that we're talking about, and despite the fact that there's great reason for pessimism of the intellect, like, nevertheless, like that sense of humor can kind of like help you be flexible and open to those opportunities when they emerge.
yeah, I guess
Right.
like when I've envisioned the tone, like the personifications of the tone, I guess, is like you're at a coffee shop explaining in plain language something that has expert stuff going on in it, but it's in everyday language to a group of people who are interested, and they follow footnotes if you have them, and there might be a doomer amongst them who's like, oh no, this will never work, but is interested enough to see what you have to say, and they have unique insights that we'll react to, and it's adding other viewpoints in a way that enhances like the collective intellect.
Yes.
So
Absolutely.
it's like the more people that are involved, including doomers, of which I don't think, I don't know, I don't usually use that label, but like I certainly am sympathetic to it. The more people that are in there observing whatever the strange thing is going on, the better the model you can construct of what it is, and develop tools to build things.
I also noticed, just not to put you on the spot, Dr. Strange, but I noticed I finally saw somebody's message here. Dr. Strange said, very interesting. And it seems like other people have seen it too. So I don't know if that means that the chat is working. If it is, feel free to drop your questions, whether it's Dr. Strange or one of these other users that we have in the chat. Extra more, QNF, GOG, TKLS, Uncle Fellow, Command Root. If anybody wants to drop their questions in the Twitch chat, we might see it maybe, or at least we saw Dr. Strange's. So, and if not, feel free to keep sending it to us via Twitter. And sorry again about this. It was working before, but
It's like it's working for some people.
Yeah, I feel like we
for
made it
one
work.
so far.
Yeah, one person.
We'll get it for next time. Don't worry.
Yeah,
Yeah.
but we've made it work. We got the old. We gave it the old college try. The So, Dr. Strange, do you have any?
We don't want to put him on the spot. Or them on the
Them,
spot.
yeah,
You said you wouldn't.
that is true.
I mean, I think the response came while we were chatting about tone.
I think so too. Yeah.
Yeah.
we're still figuring, I mean, we have a generally accepted definition of our tone right now that we're still kind of like working through, I would say.
Well, I think I mean, yes, inevitably there will be shifting, and we'll get into a groove once we publish more than one issue. Ooh, we do have a reply from Dr. Strange. Do you mind if I read it out loud? I suppose it's okay.
Sure.
There's an interesting middle ground between being a doomer and someone who's too hopeful, a standing point where you can reflect from a basis of rationality and accept the reality of what transpires, and be able to break that concept down to its most fundamental levels in order, which is most imperative given the current times, to easily present to all demographics. Yeah.
I think it's really
It's a great way of putting it.
Yeah, definitely. Yeah.
And it's interesting too to ask, what is the most fundamental level of a concept? Because that's, you know, actually sitting down to write some of these essays, part of the reason they've exploded sometimes into books, you know, once or twice, is because that is actually like a very difficult, like, where do you start if you're talking about something like economic planning or the green transition or something like that? You know, how do you, where do you even begin with that? You almost have to explain the history of the whole world in order to explain a thing like that. So having these like entry points, right, where you can kind of like, you know, honestly, but also with like a certain amount of like, you know, openness to who your listener is and what their needs are, kind of emotionally or intellectually, like be able to like tell a story, and that story is both about the thing that it's about, but it also like illuminates some bigger part of this picture, because otherwise we're like totally in the dark, but maybe it like sheds light on like some stuff that reaches beyond itself. That for me is kind of, I know that's a very vague notion, but that's for me how I've lately been thinking as a writer.
Yeah.
Like, what's a story that will be a way into some aspect of this stuff?
An entry point. Yeah, I mean, there's a certain hubris involved in like maybe marketing, which we are not doing, marketing ourselves as though we're like storming in and bringing all the answers. We don't have all the answers. We're trying to create a space to like in a very practical and democratic and like non-hierarchical way, invite as many voices into conversation about how to build solutions as possible. And of course, we're going to do our best to try to figure out, like, we're going to take our best stab at figuring out the solutions. But it's like, yeah, I totally agree with you, Dr. Strange.
So it seems like we're getting messages in the chat now. So if somebody wants to type those, feel free, and then let's see. And then if not, feel free to just copy and paste them into our DMs, which are open on Twitter, at strange_matters. And oh, here we go. From Abeyance. Oh my God, this is amazing. I don't know where all the chats were before, but they're here now.
Oh, Abeyance has just joined us.
Oh, wonderful.
Welcome.
Okay. This is great.
And just by the way, Abeyance, we are recording this, so we're going to release a recording after this. If you'd like to catch up on, there were several really great questions earlier on that covered the basics of the magazine and how we're approaching it.
There were also many wonderful technical difficulties because for some reason the chat was not showing up before for us.
Yeah, so you really weren't missing anything for 20 minutes at the beginning.
Yeah. And people were DMing their questions to us on Twitter, but it seems like now it's actually working, which is incredible. I have no idea what happened, but whatever, we'll figure it out. So Abeyance, do you have any questions for us or anybody else who's in the chat? It seems like we're getting chat messages now, so which is really exciting. So feel free to go hog wild.
I'll let our Twitter followers know that the Twitch is working. we could chat about another piece in the back pages.
Well, I kind of want to chat about Steve's piece, because I like bragging about Steve because that essay is really cool. I'll keep it brief so as not to put Steve on the spot, but like I just think that it's one of the pieces that I'm most excited about because it's not just talking about this in theoretical terms, but it's actually doing what we said we wanted to do, which is like developing these theoretical frameworks and then actually using them to like, you know, applying them to particular problems in new ways. And that's what Steve has done. So he has this essay called Notes Towards the Theory of Inflation, which talks about how there is no theory of inflation. You'd think that there would be, but no less an authority than the chairman of the Fed says that or not the chairman, but a chairman of the Fed, Tarullo, was quoted in like the business press as saying,
he's a board member. Yeah,
a board member. There we go. That there was that the Fed has no operating theory of inflation, but since the Fed is, you know, part of its mandate is to control inflation, this is a bit like saying that the person who like flies your airplane, this is a metaphor that Steve uses in the piece, and the co-pilot don't know how to fly a plane while you're on the plane. So it's kind of like interesting, but you know, the thing about it is that actually what it is that there's too many theories, and the theories have a kind of very loose relationship to anything that's observable in reality. So Steve basically summarizes the existing theories of inflation and then puts forward his own alternative theory, which he calls the supply chain theory of inflation, and is rooted in some of this heterodox microeconomic stuff that we were talking about before. And it's just this very wonderful piece to read because he summarizes it in a language that ordinary people can understand. And, you know, frankly, the theories of inflation are so confusing too that it's like difficult to make heads or tails of it because people will mix and match the different pieces of them. And he really like reconstructs that. And then when he outlines his own theory, all of it is like grounded in like actual observations of things that you can see in the real world, including the supply chain issues that are happening right now. And it's, I just think it's really illuminating. He's very humble about it too. He says something to the effect of like, if I'm wrong, then I'm wrong, but like point it out to me because, you know, like this is what it looks like to me. And I think that it's definitely like a model for how we can do more interventions in the future into these kinds of like very specific, you know, practical questions.
Yeah. Thanks, co-editor. Yeah, if I'm humble, it's because of the last part. It's just like, you can make of it what you will. But yeah, I mean, I wanted to just boil the concept down to what I thought were its first principles of like, okay, what are we talking about? Well, people set prices. How do they set those prices? Okay, they set it these specific ways. When do they decide to raise prices? Oh, they do it when this happens. And we know this because there were surveys done by economists. One of them, weirdly, was a neoclassical, more mainstream economist who did the survey, and then he found results that he didn't like, so he didn't really do anything with it. But it showed that like, oh, the firms are actually setting their own prices. There isn't some market price that they just take. And it's based on these rules about production and their supply of what they need, the inputs to produce their good. And it doesn't seem to be reducible to either how much money there is out there or how much demand in the macroeconomic sense there is. It seems to be like more about the supply chains and on the supply side. Not that kind of supply side economics that you're probably might be thinking of, but rather the actual productive capacities and labor and stuff available to make things given the number of orders that are coming in. And so if your costs are going up at a certain rate for a certain duration of time, eventually companies look at the price lever, so to speak, and say, oh, that's looking more tempting each day in terms of raising the prices. And there's some dynamics involved, and there's some actually like chaotic processes as far as like when firms choose to raise their prices instead of using other tools, like say simply taking fewer orders or hoarding inputs that they use in order to maintain themselves as going concerns, in the sense of they can financially and physically reproduce themselves.
So I want to make sure that folks feel like if they've got questions, throw them out there. It can be about anything. It could be about articles that we've mentioned that you want to hear more about. It can be about what Steve just said about inflation. It can be about the magazine. It can be about us. Definitely don't hold back. I know that some of you were just typing in the chat, so you definitely can, or at least we can see you, which is different from a while ago. So if any of y'all got any questions, let us know. And then if you're typing in the chat, we still can't see you, make sure to send us DMs at the Twitter, which is at @strange_matters. If we see them there, we'll throw them into the chat too. So just let us know. And if not, we'll keep going.
We could talk about Mary's piece.
We could talk about
Mary Steffenhagen. She's put together this excellent piece in the back pages, a profile on the gonzo journalist Robert Evans. Do you want to elaborate, JMC?
Oh, I could. I was thinking you might, but I think
go for it, JMC.
Okay, cool. Yeah. So, Robert Evans is it's difficult to describe exactly what he is. And Mary uses a couple of different terms in the piece, but he's basically an anti-fascist journalist. And he got his start as a comedian on Cracked, and then kind of like moved from there to conflict journalism of all things, because I think Vice had like people who used to go out to like the Syrian civil war and Ukraine during the Russian invasion and things like that, and do like Vice News reports. And then he did that for a couple years in some of the hottest war zones around. Like he covered the YPG's campaign against ISIS, for example. And then he returned to the United States and ended up like basically doing the same thing, because he returned right after 2016 when the Trump election happened, and then everything just kind of blew up, and there was all sorts of kind of like street battles between anti-fascists and fascists, and the Charlottesville the events at Charlottesville, the Battle of Charlottesville, as some people call it, which ended up leading to the death of an anti-fascist at the hands of fascists, Heather Heyer, and then the kind of like ongoing battles that happened in different campuses in different cities around the country over the course of the next several years, and then the Floyd uprising, of course, in 2020. So Evans developed a reputation because he would be at all of those, like live streaming them usually. So you would have him with like his GoPro or whatever, like walking around and talking to people, and you could just like watch on his YouTube channel. And he also developed like all these different podcasts that would talk about these, he had a podcast about called Behind the Bastard, which is about like various kinds of capitalist oligarchs or statist, imperialists, or people who committed genocide or participated in it, and blah 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 blah. And then he would do like a little profile of them, each one per episode. And then he would do then he had this other one, he has a lot of podcasts. Like he's thrown them out like on a continual basis, to the point where like there's a kind of, and Mary kind of jokes about this and also kind of critiques it a little bit in a largely sympathetic way, but still critiquing it, like the podcast empire, right? Like Robert Evans Incorporated is kind of a thing now. And it's interesting because the overall theme, Evans started out as like a libertarian, like in the American sense of like a propertarian, a free market person, because he comes from like a very like rural white conservative religious background. But then like, you know, over the course of his evolution, he became like a hard leftist and became some variety or other of anarchist is what he identifies as now. And he was very inspired particularly by the Rojava Revolution, which he was an eyewitness to in Syria. So he oftentimes has these slogans about like, not like, you know, no role models, no heroes, you know, like kind of thing, which is funny because he himself has become kind of like a celebrity at this point. And that's not necessarily a contradiction, but it is a tension. And that's something that Mary kind of explores in the end of her piece a little bit, which kind of ends with the founding of Cool Zone Media, which is the new kind of not so much a company. I think it's like a division of iHeartRadio that has like the Evans podcasts. And it's interesting because this isn't in the piece, but just recently, Cool Zone Media announced that it was trying to unionize iHeartRadio. So you know they're fighting the good fight against even their own bosses, which is great. But yeah, so it's a wonderful little portrait. I mean, Mary Steffenhagen is a top-notch reporter. She is an early career journalist. She went to CUNY Journalism School in New York City. I met her through DSA LSC organizing back when she was in Minnesota. We worked together on the pamphlets that LSC put out. Very sharp editor as well as a writer. We are so lucky to have gotten her because she basically did a New Yorker style profile of somebody that the New Yorker would like never profile. So it's just this like very, very exciting piece to have published because it's, you know, as far as reporting goes, we haven't talked a lot about reporting, but what I was trying to say in a previous rant about like the decline due to capitalism of reporting and other sorts of like public service aspects of journalism, if you want to call it that. Like Mary Steffenhagen's piece gives me confidence that we might actually be able to put a dent in that and actually like fight back against it and produce some of the stuff that capitalist media has not produced for the most part, because her piece is so good that it, like, you know, hopefully it'll attract other people who want to write that kind of thing, because they'll know that Strange Matters is a home for serious investigative journalism or serious journalistic profiles and international coverage, et cetera, et cetera.
So do we have any questions in DMs or in the Twitch chat? No, not at the moment.
Okay.
So yeah, if anybody in the chat, Abeyance, Uncle Fellow, the Commander Root, Extra More, anybody has if anybody has questions, speak now or forever hold your peace. Because actually we've been at it for several hours, so I would say that 3:30 is not, well, 3:30 EST is not the worst time to wrap, but at the same time, if somebody has questions, we can go further into it. So it's up to y'all.
It also, yeah, I mean, let's give it a couple of minutes because
yeah, okay.
It may take a couple of minutes to draft a text.
Yeah, of course. Maybe we could have a little go round of like, not that this is the conclusion, but just to give people time for any last questions that they have to type them up. We go around each of us and do some kind of concluding statement. Like, I don't know, what should it be? Something like, okay, here's my question for all of us, and I'll go last. What are your hopes for the magazine going forward?
Should I go first?
Yeah, go for it, Steve.
Okay. This isn't my only hope, but one of the foremost hopes, I guess, is either we create a little bubble or we latch on to an existing bubble of really egalitarian, worker-led, owned and controlled socialism to the extent that it can exist within a capitalist society, as we obviously are. There's worker cooperatives all over the place. Some of them have sort of like little zones of control with each other, but I feel like there's a lot of practical work that simply getting the magazine out and having a space for people who are doing the work of these groups and of social movements as well, to give them a voice, look at what they're doing, examine it objectively, and try to reproduce what works with as many people as possible involved in that kind of decision making and observation process will help us create a space for socialism that it doesn't need. You don't need to get victories in Congress, although if that happened, it would be great. But like it's something that you can do right now and meet people's needs, socially provision us, all that good stuff, just ourselves. And yeah, like if we can propagate ideas through the magazine that help aid that process, that would be great.
That's awesome. Francis?
So what comes to mind as the most exciting, like, win I can anticipate in the coming months for the magazine, it's to receive a whole bunch of submissions from writers all over the show. Because it's actually really delightful editing them and, sitting around and workshopping them and having some back and forth with the writers who have graciously submitted to us thus far. It's a really wonderful process, and I am so excited to, if people think we're like good enough to submit their stuff to, and they'll trust us to, treat them respectfully, and I'm mixing two thoughts. If people will trust us with their work, that'll be just so wonderful to me. And secondly, I can't wait to be a magazine that pushes for change in the industry. And yeah, those two are intertwined for me, those two ideas.
Yeah. That's awesome. It's tough to know what to say given that you both were so eloquent. I guess I would say my hope for the magazine, I guess I would divide it into like my hopes in terms of its like intellectual accomplishments and my hopes in terms of its practical accomplishments. I hope that intellectually the magazine turns out to be a space, and this is partly up to us, partly up to our writers, and partly up to our audience, I think, and particularly the way that they become involved through letters or through the community, through Discord, through whatever it is that we end up kind of creating together. It ends up being this kind of dynamo for the generation of new ways of thinking and new ways of seeing, new ways of creating, and new ways of being in community. And that is a mission that obviously impacts the left, because some of the things that we'll be building together will be, theoretical and practical concepts, frameworks, methodologies, and blueprints for the building of libertarian socialism. But some of it extends far beyond that political thing. Because, what's the point of libertarian socialism, right? The society where ordinary working people control production and investment, if it doesn't mean that it generates a society where then, as a result of the fact that everything has been democratized, people get to truly, both as individuals and as collectives, explore the things that matter to them and become the kind of people that they want to be, and build and create the kind of culture and art and science and architecture and cities and whatever that they want to build, right? So a lot of what we would create, hopefully, would be not just like the methodologies and the concepts and the blueprints for socialism, but actually for this kind of liberated society in general, right? And hopefully, like, it would expand our current culture's idea of what is possible, and spark people's imagination, so that maybe a Strange Matters reader who isn't even a socialist, but is some apolitical person or goody two-shoes liberal or whatever, nevertheless, like, they're a scientist, and some science article that we wrote inspires their imagination, and they do a discovery that they wouldn't have done otherwise, or something like that. You know, that's the dream, I think. Or similarly, like, I don't know, like a neo-modernist painter or something like that. And then practically, what I would like would be for Strange Matters to be, you know, an engine for generating tools that help people build dual power institutions, right? These zones of control, you know, with real resources under the direct control of ordinary working people organized in a direct democracy. And then also, like, you know, the first zone, so to speak, where that exists internally, where we're learning how to do it together as a magazine. And then maybe, like, through the combination of building resources that help people do that and building up other cooperatives or other aspects of the business, or helping our friends who are doing cooperatives and all this other stuff, kind of build this network that really not just like prefigures the alternative economy, but actually is the alternative economy, kind of growing within the decaying body of the old one. That would be my my dream, basically. Now, I mean, if we can accomplish even a fraction of that, it will have been worth all the trouble. But definitely, in terms of my maximalist dreams, those are.
James C's goal is like long term.
Yeah, you know. Yeah, the magazine will be a success if we achieve the international emancipation of the proletariat or whatever, you know, and the radical reconstruction of global society into world culture, international peace, and end to all wars, the development of global consciousness, you know, world literature, blah, blah.
I mean, we make a pretty good start.
I would say so.
Not bad.
The Abeyance says LOL piece of cake. Yeah.
Right. Yeah.
That's the spirit.
NBD.
So folks, last opportunity. Any questions that you have for us, we would love to answer them. If not, we can probably get started wrapping up the event. So just let us know. We are seeing the Zoom chat, or sorry, not the Zoom chat, the Twitch stream chat. As
well as the Twitter DMs.
As well as the Twitter DMs, yes.
If we could get both working, that would be good in general.
Yeah.
Like
Abeyance has given us a question. A bit of a broad question, but how do you respond to the idea that a libertarian socialist vision cannot respond to the urgent challenges of climate collapse and the pandemic? Very on point. What might be some strategies for pushing back on technocracy or empowering individuals to make decisions in their own lives while still assuring competent and timely responses to problems on a mass scale? Very important question, and one that we deal with in depth in one of our issue 1 pieces. But yes. I'll let James C run wild because he seems like he's brimming with an answer.
I actually don't want to answer first because it'll be a long response. If somebody wants to go first, feel free. But I'm so glad that you asked that question because it's a central motivating question of the magazine.
I mean, my immediate response is that I think there's a prevailing perception that, especially on the left, that we need to give way to like authoritarian methods in order to address pressing issues. But I'm not sure that authoritarianism has been terribly successful in the past. Like we look at Soviet Russia, and it fell apart. That's my initial very brief response. Steve, do you want to take it?
Yeah, I mean, well, this touches upon one of the reasons why I'm a socialist, actually, is that more people, more minds trained upon a problem generally increases your likelihood of solving the problem. And if, in order for all of those minds to feel like they can fully engage, they need full ownership and control over the process compared to everyone else. They need equals. And if you have one guy controlling everything, he's more likely to screw up than if it is, say, 2 or 2 million people. And on that level, I'm like, okay, libertarian socialism deserves serious consideration at the very least. And like when you look at anarchist Spain and other libertarian projects, like the Zapatistas or someone, like you have areas where like when you can get supply chains and supply networks operating under principles of libertarian socialism, meaning equal ownership and control over the means of production, democratic ways of decision making on the shop floor and how you do production and whatnot. I mean, that's like almost like my definition of socialism pretty much. But I think it would literally, it is not only a moral aspiration, but I think it would deliver better infrastructure and outcomes and products and stuff than hierarchical control over production and distribution, for the simple reason that there are more people involved and there are whole greater than the sum of its parts type considerations to adding people into the process and giving them reasons to believe that they have they have a right to participate just as much as anyone else.
Yeah, that's a great answer, guys. It's very difficult to answer this as briefly as I think the occasion allows us to, because this is exploring the reason why libertarian socialism is not only possible in light of this critique, but actually why it's actually strengthened by a real consideration of how almost everything works. That's one of the central missions of the magazine, and there's many, many different angles to it. I think that the notion that you need authoritarian, centralized, top-down methods in order to be able to mobilize the planned economy in such a manner as to solve the ecological crisis or the pandemic is one of the fallacies, and it is a fallacy in my view, that has kind of driven a lot of people who otherwise would be libertarian or even just democratic socialists into the arms of neo-Leninism, or even in the cases of those who have gone right, into fascism. And there are, in fact, fascists and crypto-fascists with some of them with big funding from tech, in magazines like First Things and American Affairs and Palladium, who are currently trying to figure out how to do economic planning in a top-down centralized way in order to replace liberal democracy with some kind of authoritarian system which is run, what they call post-liberalism, which would be run along the lines that the Communist Party uses to run China, or that the Lee Kuan Yew's party uses to run Singapore, except that instead of those structures, it would be some kind of committee of tech billionaires and their appointed technocrats. And that, so the threat of this kind of mentality is not just of leftists kind of degenerating into the old mistakes that they've made in the past, but also the rise of new forms of authoritarianism from the far right. And the thing is that, again, the moral question aside of what's a better and what's a worse society to live in, there is significant reason to believe, and this comes from research across the social sciences, like anthropology, from, you know, even like bourgeois capitalist management science, from supply chain management, from, you know, the economics that has dealt seriously with the question of economic planning, like the Leontief input-output stuff. I guess you guys don't know what that means yet, but the people who have dealt with the question of how to plan national economies in contexts like World War II, like the top-down centralized stuff actually doesn't work. Like, I mean, it works fine enough for certain things, like if you want to build up an initial base of heavy industry, although even then you might do so at the expense of a famine that might have been prevented with less dumb methods. Because part of it is what Steve was talking about, you know, where people who have kind of buy-in because they have a say in the process are going to perform better, and also you get to like leverage their information insights. But just to expand on that point, it's kind of like, you know, if you have somebody who's at the very top who's telling everybody you have to do this by this date, right? And it's a system of top-down command and control using heavy coercion, the stick more than the carrot, where like if people fail to meet their targets, they, you know, get at the very least removed from their position, possibly even imprisoned or shot, right? That's a situation where if the big guy who doesn't know everything that's going on in all the different places demands something that's impossible, people are going to lie to cover their asses and then, you know, say, oh yeah, I accomplished this, I met my target, even though they didn't. But everybody else was depending upon their labor. So just in the same way as when you lie to the boss because you're scared of the consequences, you know, at work of not meeting your target, that ends up screwing other people who were depending on your work, which maybe your boss even tells you that, although they shouldn't have made you feel scared. That was the boss's issue and not yours, right? Like, you know, in the same way, if you have an economy that's structured from the top down, or even just a capitalist firm that's structured from the top down, you're going to be sending imaginary machine parts to factories that need it, that only get the wrong parts in reality and too few of them. And then they're not going to be able to build the thing that somebody else was depending upon. And then they're not going to be able to do the thing that somebody else was depending upon. And therefore, you're going to basically have these bottlenecks that mean that things don't get done. And that's just a very simple example of it. It's, you know, there's many, many different layers to this question, but it turns out that more what we would call decentralized models, which doesn't always mean like anything goes, everybody does whatever they want. It means ways of structuring the decision-making process such that everybody who's affected by a decision to the greatest extent possible has a say over the decision, and decisions that affect everybody are through one mechanism or another, getting input from all the different discrete sectors. Like those processes are actually extremely robust. Like even within capitalism, firms that have kind of made these concessions to anarcho-syndicalist principles tend to outperform the kind of old school mid-century style top-down Fordist command and control models. That was part of what the rise of what was called the Toyota production system was about. Although, of course, one doesn't want to exaggerate the extent to which capitalist firms can be democratic, because as long as there's a dictatorship of the owners and their hired managers, you're never going to actually get the true results of real democracy, which will probably to some extent be more efficient. And there are trade-offs, obviously, here. You don't want to exaggerate the extent to which there are no trade-offs between democracy and efficiency, but there's a lot fewer of them than people think. And I have seen with my own eyes the efficiencies that can come from setting up a democratic process where different people with different expertise, different life experiences are able to have input. People who have objections to some decision are listened to so that their objections are taken into account and the decision is modified in order to integrate it so that then they vote for it. Like all of these kinds of tricks that have to do with radical democracy and libertarian socialism and anarchism, like all of those tricks make things more efficient and make the end products better and prevent the kind of catastrophe that happens when you try to force things through in an authoritarian manner. So I would even go so far as to say that some of the most pressing problems that we have, like the need for a green transition due to climate change and all this other stuff, if we don't adopt, at least in part, libertarian socialist methods, we won't be able to overcome them. I would actually go the other extreme and say it is actually for lack of libertarian socialism that we will quite likely, you know, fuck these things up. So there's a lot here. even a lot of the stuff that I said is not stuff that we've written up yet, although some of it is in the Libertarian Socialism editorial. This is going to be one of the main subject matters of the magazine, is making arguments to this effect against authoritarian command and control in general across fields, whether it's in politics, economics, the way that cities are planned, the way that people engage in their interpersonal interactions, like, and then kind of like building up grounded models with actual empirical backing about how it is that we can do democracy and why democracy is better. So if you want to read that kind of stuff, you know, read and subscribe to our magazine and give us, you know, whatever donations you can come March 1st.
And also give us a retweet and, you know, support us in any way you can.
Yeah.
So do we want to wrap up? Conclusions or?
Yeah, I mean, you already gave us a round of conclusions, if you recall, what we want from the magazine.
Oh, yes.
Yeah.
Well, maybe like next steps. Maybe like next steps for people, right? Because we do still have actually people in the chat. So what are like next steps if people want to help us? What can they do?
Oh, by the way, Abeyance gave us a couple of responses.
Oh, okay, sorry.
I think it was while you were on your run about libertarian socialism. Right, if people aren't alienated from the world around them, then it's possible to have an investment in the outcome. And there would be less incentives to hide information or mislead people when it comes to the examples I mentioned. I'm an anarchist, but there is always the devil's advocate question that I feel like other leftists try to dangle over us. Mm-hmm. Also, new technology and the internet creates possibilities for coordinating beyond localism, i.e. cybernetics.
Absolutely.
I never, they never knew that about the Toyota model, which you mentioned, James C. Yeah. Thanks so much, Abeyance.
Yeah, great question.
Thank you.
Yeah.
And hopefully, I mean, like we don't want to be a libertarian socialist magazine that's afraid of that question, because honestly, I think a lot of anarchists are afraid of that question because they know that they don't have an answer to it. And look, it's not like we have the answer to it, but you know, we've been researching and we have some promising leads that we want to share with people. But more to the point, we want to create a space where we can together, all of us, not just us, but like the readers, the writers, etc., figure out the answers to that question, because nobody has the answer. And the quicker that we admit that, the quicker we can actually like start figuring out how to do these things.
Yep.
Shall we go to next steps?
Yeah.
So certainly sharing, retweeting, and liking anything from our Twitter or our Facebook account is a great way to support us. We I believe we're trying to do another one of these Twitch events prior to our launch on March 1st.
Yes, we're thinking of doing it with one of our writers about their article, but we have to actually like talk to them and see whether they'd be down.
Well, I mean, we'll let you know, of course, but yeah, we're planning to have one more pre-launch event before March 1st when the launch starts. Other than that, yeah, just spreading the good word on Twitter certainly will help.
Yeah, do we want to drop the link for all our social media in the chat, just so that, because we have a Facebook, a Twitter, and an Instagram so far. So definitely following us there. There's also the Indiegogo. So that starts March 1st. That's when you can give us money if you have it. There'll be different levels that you can contribute at, and each one has its own special perks. We're really excited about the perks. We think that you will be too. And obviously, like, you know, beyond the minimum level, like you'll get a subscription, you know, to the magazine and be able to get it continually. If you want to sign up early and get email updates about these like upcoming events that we're going to do still in the pre-launch period, or or get reminded on March 1st when the fundraiser happens, and get updates about it if there are any. That you can join our email list on the Indiegogo pre-launch page, which we should also probably drop in the chat.
It's a pinned tweet to our Twitter currently.
Yes, that is true too.
If you want to look there.
Yeah. And so that's another thing that you can do if you want to drop your email. If you're here, you probably already did, just because of how we shared the Twitch link. But if you're not, then definitely drop your email there. And yeah, when March 1st comes around, if you could, not only donate if you can, but also tell your friends. In fact, telling your friends is as important or more as donating. So if you don't have the money to donate, spreading the word to your friends is as important. Drop some of these links when the fundraiser goes live. Drop the link maybe in your group chats or posting on your socials about us. If you think that the mission of the magazine is cool and you want it to be successful, I would urge you to spread the word about it, because that's definitely going to be the thing that determines whether or not we are able to build the community that would allow us to go forward, into the future. Is if it's we spread the word successfully.
Cool. So is that it?
I think so.
Oh, parting with such sweet sorrow.
Thank you for all of your questions, for real.
Yeah, they were really excellent.
They're great questions. We hope we explained enough of what the magazine is, who we are, and we'll be back with another live event pretty soon. So watch out for that.
All right. Bye, everybody. This was wonderful. Thank you so much.
Bye.
Where do we end?